Part 1. A Name in the Ledger. Margaret Garner does not begin in history as a voice. She begins as an entry. In the surviving architecture of slavery, the first solid thing you can hold is not a letter in her handwriting, not a diary page, not a photograph. It is a line of ink arranged to serve someone else's certainty. A ledger is designed to make doubt expensive. It exists to convert flesh into figures, kinship into increase, grief into depreciation, and the future into collateral. Before Margaret becomes a headline, before she becomes a courtroom dispute, before she becomes a scandal that cleaves public opinion, she is already inside the system's preferred grammar, recorded, counted, and kept. A name appears in these records like a handle on a locked door. It lets the archivist pull, but it does not guarantee anything opens. Margaret may be written beside a number, an age, an appraisal, a task. It may be paired with a notation of childbearing clinical euphemisms that treat the body as a site of production. It may sit near other first names, stripped of surnames, because the system is careful about lineage only when lineage increases the owner's claim. The enslaved inherit the owner's world, not the owner's name. Paper grants family names to property holders and takes them away from the held. When modern readers reach for Margaret Garner, they often begin where the documents become loud: 1856, the Ohio River, the federal marshals, the knife. But an archive-oriented account must begin earlier, in the quieter violence that makes the later violence legible. The archive of slavery is a machine that leaves marks by design and leaves silences by design. It is full of details about transactions and sparse on details about tenderness. It tracks what can be bought, sold, insured, hunted, returned. It rarely pauses to describe what was loved. This is not an accident of time. It is a methodology of power. To understand Margaret's emergence, we must treat the ledger not as background, but as a primary actor. The ledger is where the system rehearses its theology, a world in which the owner's claim is sacred, and every other claim, especially a mother's claim, is contingent. Under slavery, motherhood is permitted, so long as it is useful. A child is not primarily a child. A child is an extension of the owner's estate, a future laborer, a line item whose value ripens with age. The mother is valued for the capacity to produce the child and for the labor she performs while producing. The ledger does not have a column for lullabies. If Margaret is recorded as a woman of childbearing age, that phrase does not mean what it means in ordinary speech. It is not a description of life. It is a valuation of function. It is a forecast. It is the system looking at the future and seeing revenue. It is the cold arithmetic that makes later moral language feel inadequate. When such a system speaks of family, it means inventory grouped for convenience, not bonds formed by choice. When it speaks of home, it means a place where work can be extracted reliably. When it speaks of care, it means maintenance of an asset. The archive teaches us, if we are willing to learn, that violence is not only an event, it is a protocol. It is policy rendered routine. Kentucky, in the middle decades of the 19th century, sits in that familiar American contradiction, close enough to free soil to taste the rumor of it, entrenched enough in human bondage to treat that rumor as a contagion. The state's documents insist on stability, property law, wills, debts, mortgages, transfers. Yet the geography itself suggests instability. The border is not merely a line on a map, it is a fracture in the moral landscape, and it runs through every enslaved household like a crack in the foundation. For the enslaved, borders are not abstract. A border is a direction whispered at night. A border is an equation: miles, patrols, frost, hunger, and the weight of a child who must not cry. But before there is flight, there is the slow accumulation of reasons. The records where they exist are unlikely to narrate those reasons. They will not tell you what it means to watch children grow in a world where their growing increases someone else's wealth. They will not describe the daily humiliations that teach a person her body is not her own. They will not capture the particular dread of a mother who understands, with complete clarity, that her children can be taken by sale, by punishment, by whim, by the owner's need for cash. Paper will show the sale. Paper will not show the months of fear before it. The archive is honest about what it values. It is also honest about what it refuses to value. This is why Margaret's eventual notoriety is so unsettling to the legal order. It is not only that she commits an act the law calls murder, it is that she commits an act that interrupts the ledger's logic. The ledger expects the enslaved to endure, to survive, to produce. It expects women to bear children who can be counted. It expects the future to be harvestable. In that logic, even suffering is an investment. Margaret's later choice, whatever language one uses for it, shatters the expectation that the system can always reclaim what it has claimed. Yet even in the years before that rupture, the groundwork is visible if you read the archive against itself. A document that lists enslaved persons by first name alone is already a confession. The system is not interested in their full identity. A bill of sale that transfers a mother and children separately is already a warning. The system recognizes bonds only to exploit them. A census that counts enslaved persons as numbers rather than names is already an admission. The state participates in a fiction that makes citizens out of owners and makes commodities out of the owned. In an archive-oriented telling, we do not pretend the records are neutral. We treat them as artifacts of intent. Margaret's presence in the record is therefore double. She is there as a human being, irreducibly real, with a body that endured time and weather and childbirth and grief. And she is there as a legal abstraction, a fugitive, even before she runs, because slavery always assumes flight is a natural impulse that must be suppressed. The law's language, property, custody, recovery hovers around her like a net. It does not need her consent. It requires only her capture. And still, within this machinery, another set of facts persists, stubborn and uncommodified. Margaret is a mother. Whatever the system says, her children are not extensions of an estate. They are separate lives, bound to her by blood, proximity, and the daily labor of keeping them alive in a place designed to break them. The archive does not like to acknowledge this, because acknowledging it would require acknowledging that slavery is not merely an economic arrangement, but a continuous assault on the most basic human claims: the right to one's body, the right to one's labor, the right to one's child. So, part 1 is not a prologue, it is the first indictment. It is the moment we agree to read the ledger as a crime scene. Margaret Garner's later story will be told in headlines and legal arguments, in sermons and pamphlets, in the bitter theater of courts that debate jurisdiction while a family bleeds. But the first truth is quieter. Before anyone comes with warrants, the system has already taken her. Before the marshals step over a threshold, the state has already set the terms. Before the knife, before the river, before the ice, there is a page where her name is written for someone else's benefit. And that, too, is violence archived, normalized, and waiting. Part 2. The border that promised nothing. A border is supposed to mean something. It is supposed to separate one jurisdiction from another, one set of laws from the next, one kind of life from another. On maps, it looks clean, decisive, an inked certainty that implies order. But for the enslaved in the mid-19th century Ohio Valley, the line between Kentucky and Ohio was not a guarantee. It was an argument. It was a rumor with teeth. It promised nothing, and it punished those who believed it too quickly. The United States liked to call Ohio free. Kentucky was slave. The words sounded like opposites, like a moral geometry with two clear angles. Yet the border between them, drawn along the river, did not divide humanity from inhumanity. It divided methods. It changed the paperwork. It altered the uniforms of the men who came to claim you. It shifted the language from plantation discipline to municipal procedure. But it did not, by itself, break the chain. In the archive, the border appears as a set of practical instructions. Roads, ferries, counties, patrol patterns, notices posted on walls, rewards printed in newspapers. It is a geography of containment. The border is not simply the river. It is everything arranged around the river to keep bodies on the correct side. On the Kentucky side, slavery is overt and local, enforced by owners, overseers, and county authorities who treat it as ordinary. On the Ohio side, the enforcement is less visible, but no less real, because federal law reaches across the line like a long arm, and because money and ideology do not stop at water. Ohio's free soil did not mean a free welcome. It meant a contested ground where freedom had to be proven, defended, and often purchased with silence. Black communities in Ohio lived under threat not only from slave catchers, but from neighbors, employers, and officials who could be persuaded that enforcement was civic duty. The archive records this in the small details: the advertisements that assume cooperation, the statements that treat capture as restoration, the official language that frames the return of fugitives as maintenance of order. In that world, the river is not a shield. It is a checkpoint. The border also reshaped time. On one side, a person could be sold tomorrow without warning. On the other, a person could be seized today under a legal claim and be back across the river before nightfall. Freedom, if it existed at all, existed in intervals, hours and days measured against pursuit. The line did not remove danger, it changed its tempo. The system learned to move quickly, to compress the distance between suspicion and retrieval, between rumor and arrest. In the logic of slavery, escape is never treated as a human decision. It is treated as theft. A person crossing into Ohio is not described as seeking safety, but as absconding. The word is an accusation disguised as description. It turns a mother's fear into a property crime. It turns a family's flight into a disruption of commerce. And once the act is framed that way, every tool of state power becomes available to correct it. This is why the border promised nothing, because the law on one side was never allowed to remain only on that side. The Fugitive Slave Act, older versions, and the more aggressive federal enforcement in the 1,850 seconds functioned as a corridor built through the map. It was a legal passageway that owners could enter and federal agents could walk without asking permission from local conscience. In that framework, Ohio was not a refuge. It was a stage on which capture could be performed with procedural legitimacy. A claimant presented papers. A commissioner or judge recognized the claim. Marshals executed the order. The archive loves this part. Names, dates, signatures, seals. The documents make it look clean. They make it look inevitable. They are designed to make resistance seem irrational. But the enslaved understood something the documents did not want to acknowledge. The border was still a fracture in power. Even if the law could reach, the law could not erase the fact that one step north changed what was possible. In Ohio, there were abolitionist networks, black communities, and sympathetic allies who could hide, feed, transport, and warn. There were also hostile actors, informants, bounty hunters, and officials who saw compliance as patriotic. The border was not freedom, it was an altered battlefield. And in that altered battlefield, a family's calculations became brutal. To attempt the crossing was to gamble against a system that specialized in recovery. It meant weighing the risk of capture against the certainty of staying. It meant considering the children not as symbols, but as bodies that would slow you down and amplify sound. It meant choosing a season. Winter could be cruel, but winter could also be cover. Frozen ground might hold footprints more clearly, but frozen rivers could become bridges. Darkness could conceal, but darkness could also disorient. Every advantage came with a cost. What the archive gives us are the outlines of those decisions. It provides evidence of preparation, the timing of departure, the selection of routes, the choice of shelter on the Ohio side. It records the infrastructure of flight almost by accident, because every successful escape provoked a reaction, and reactions leave paper. When people fled, owners and officials responded with notices and demands. They described the fugitives' appearance, their skills, their suspected destinations. In doing so, they preserved fragments of personhood they otherwise refused to acknowledge. A scar, a manner of speaking, a trade, a family relationship. The archive cannot help but reveal humanity while trying to capture it. The border's moral ambiguity also saturates the public language of the time. Many white Northerners opposed slavery in the abstract, but opposed fugitives in practice. They treated the presence of escaped families as a disturbance to social peace, a provocation that might invite Southern anger or economic retaliation. The archive contains their anxieties in speeches and editorials, the insistence on law and order, the complaint about agitators, the desire to keep politics out of neighborhoods that had been built on exclusion. In that rhetoric, the border becomes a compromise line. Slavery over there, discomfort over here. Do not bring the problem north. Do not make us choose. But the fugitives made the choice unavoidable by existing. Margaret Garner's story will later be framed as a confrontation between a mother and a legal system. In this part, we see the legal system laying its groundwork in the landscape itself. Kentucky is a place where her children's futures can be sold. Ohio is a place where those children can be seized back. The border is the narrow strip where hope and enforcement overlap. It is where the family's desire for freedom meets the state's insistence on possession. This is what the border promised, not sanctuary, but escalation. And still, people crossed. They crossed because captivity is not stable, it is continuous harm. They crossed because the logic of slavery did not merely threaten the body, it threatened the meaning of family. Under slavery, a mother cannot assume her child will remain within reach. She cannot assume her child will grow up with a name that stays intact. She cannot assume that tomorrow will include the same faces as today. The border, even with its deceptions, offered one thing the plantation did not: the possibility, however thin, of a different jurisdiction, a different set of witnesses, a different kind of leverage. But leverage is not safety. It is only a chance to negotiate. So the border becomes a paradox. It is both an opening and a trap. It is the line that makes the idea of freedom vivid enough to pursue, and the same line that concentrates the forces determined to prevent it. Along the Ohio River, the country's moral contradictions are compressed into a single strip of water. On that water, geography does not save you. It only gives you a direction to run. When people say, "Just cross the river," they speak as if the river is a door. It is not. It is a threshold that does not close behind you. The law can step over it. The hunters can follow. The past can reach into the present and pull. And in 1856, when Margaret Garner and her family moved toward that threshold, they are not stepping into certainty. They are stepping into the space where the state's promises dissolve and only consequence remains. Part 3. Winter crossing. The Ohio frozen. Winter does not erase a border. It only changes the border's surface. In the Ohio Valley, the river is usually a moving fact water that insists on distance, water that punishes haste. But in the deep cold of 1856, the Ohio River hardens into something else, a corridor that should not exist, an accidental bridge built by weather. Ice is not mercy. It is a different kind of hazard, the kind that does not look like violence until it breaks. The archive rarely describes the cold directly, but it does not need to. You can infer it from the choices people made, from the improbable decision to take children out into night air and walk toward a river that, in warmer months, would have required a boat. When the enslaved flee, the documents that survive tend to frame the act as a disturbance, an owner deprived, a community unsettled, property in motion. Yet the physical reality is more intimate and more brutal than the language allows. Flight is not an idea. It is breath turning to frost. It is the ache in hands that cannot stay gloved because gloves make noise and clumsiness. It is the careful distribution of weight across ice that holds until it decides not to. It is the human body forced into calculations it never consented to perform. Margaret Garner and her family enter this winter landscape carrying what the law refuses to recognize, a family bond stronger than the owner's claim. The archive will later make much of their capture, their return, their status. But on the night of the crossing, status is reduced to simple imperatives. Keep the children quiet, keep them close, keep moving. The river does not care about statutes. The river cares about weight and temperature. The winter does not care about ownership. The winter cares about exposure. What can be said with certainty is limited to what the record preserves. That they fled Kentucky, that they moved toward Ohio, that the river was frozen, that they made it across. Around those facts, the archive becomes a field of echoes, later testimony, newspaper accounts, the polished recollections of advocates and opponents who each had reasons to emphasize or obscure. No single record gives the full journey as lived. The journey must be reconstructed like a broken object, by aligning shards, by acknowledging missing pieces, by refusing to pretend the reconstruction is the original. This is where an archive-oriented tone becomes necessary. It disciplines the imagination. It insists that where the record is silent, we do not insert comfort. Even so, certain truths press through the silence because they are structural. The first is that the decision to run in winter suggests desperation as much as strategy. Winter can reduce certain risks. Patrol patterns shift, nights are longer, some routes are less traveled, but it multiplies others. Children are less capable of enduring cold. Clothing becomes heavier. Frostbite does not announce itself. It simply takes. A frozen river can look stable right up to the moment it fractures underfoot. The choice to cross on ice is a choice made by people who understand that remaining is worse than the gamble. The second truth is that flight with children is not flight as a single act. It is flight as a continuous negotiation with sound, hunger, and fatigue. Every cry is a beacon. Every pause is an invitation to pursuit. Adults can be commanded into stillness. Children must be persuaded. In the archive, children appear as extensions, numbers, ages, issue. On the river, they are bodies to be carried, soothed, restrained, protected. The mother becomes both shelter and restraint, both comfort and command. If the winter crossing reveals anything, it reveals that motherhood under slavery is not sentimental, it is operational. The third truth is that this crossing is not a leap from slavery into freedom. It is a movement from one legal climate into another, and the new climate is not warm. The family's destination is not a borderless world. It is Ohio, a state whose free status is compromised by federal enforcement and local hostility. The crossing is a change in jurisdiction, not an erasure of danger. Still, the crossing matters because it makes the system react. It forces the machinery to move. The river's ice becomes an irony written by nature, a brief suspension of the barrier that the state depends on. For a moment, the map behaves as though it disagrees with the law. A river that usually separates becomes passable, and that passability becomes a threat. The system can tolerate many things: labor extracted, bodies punished, families split, but it cannot tolerate the idea that the enslaved might move themselves beyond the owner's reach. The crossing is therefore not merely a physical act, it is a declaration that the owner's claim is not inevitable. And declarations, in a world built on possession, invite retaliation. The archive contains the traces of the world on the Ohio side, the places fugitives sought out, the people they trusted, the networks that existed in the interstices of a hostile society. Such networks were not uniform and not always safe. They were human, which means they were courageous and compromised, vigilant and vulnerable. A free black community could offer shelter and still be infiltrated. An abolitionist ally could offer assistance and still be watched. The very existence of these networks provoked a second network: informants, bounty hunters, men who treated pursuit as employment and capture as sport. This is where the crossing shifts from a test of endurance to a test of concealment. On the far bank, the family must become invisible in a place that is watching. They must trust strangers in a nation that has taught strangers to profit from betrayal. The archive records these risks indirectly through the speed of the subsequent response. The faster the marshals arrive, the more porous the supposed refuge was. The tighter the net becomes, the clearer it is that Free State is not a shield when the federal government is willing to act as the owner's agent. Even the phrase crossing can mislead. It suggests a clear start and a clear end, as if the river were a single obstacle. But the crossing is only the most dramatic segment of a longer passage, leaving Kentucky without being detected, moving toward the river, traversing the ice, reaching Ohio, finding a place to hide, and enduring the interval before the knock at the door. Each stage demands different skills: silence, direction, courage, restraint, and any failure at any stage collapses the whole attempt. The archive's later accounts tend to compress all this into a clean narrative. They escaped. They were found. Compression is one of the archive's violences. It shrinks lived terror into a few sentences so the reader can move on. But the people who walked that ice did not experience compression. They experienced duration. They experienced each minute as a separate exposure, each sound as a possible end. The river, frozen, becomes a witness that cannot testify. It holds the weight of bodies and then releases the season's evidence back into water. It leaves no footprints that survive thaw. It offers no written statement. It does what the archive often does. It allows an event to happen and then refuses to keep a full record of it. So we are left with the outline and the consequences. The outline is a family moving under winter pressure toward a boundary that is also a trap. The consequences are a legal system forced into motion, a pursuit legitimized by statute, and an imminent collision between a mother's claim and the nation's claim to enforce ownership across free ground. The crossing is the hinge, the moment when private desperation becomes public crisis. In the cold, the Ohio River becomes briefly traversable. In that brief window, Margaret Garner's family steps onto ice that should not have been an option because no one should have needed it. That is the central horror that the archive cannot soften. The path to freedom in this country was sometimes a frozen river in the dark, walked by children whose safety was never part of the law's design. And once the crossing is done, once the ice is behind them, the promise they have reached is not peace. It is pursuit arriving in a new uniform. It is the state reasserting its reach. The river may freeze, but the machinery does not. Part 4. The Fugitive Slave Act, Federal Hands. The United States did not merely allow slavery to exist. It built mechanisms to keep it from leaking. When Margaret Garner and her family crossed into Ohio, they did not step out of the reach of law. They stepped into the reach of a different law, one designed precisely to make free soil a temporary illusion. The Fugitive Slave Act was not a local custom or a regional preference. It was a federal promise, written in statute, that ownership would be defended even when it crossed state lines. It turned the nation itself into an enforcement apparatus. It made the border less a boundary than a conveyor belt. In the archive, the Fugitive Slave Act appears in its preferred form, procedure. There are warrants, affidavits, commissioners, hearings. There is paperwork that pretends to be calm. The law speaks in neutral verbs: deliver, remove, return, as if what is being transported is luggage. It does not speak the word that would make its reality undeniable: kidnapping. It does not speak the word that would expose its moral center, coercion. It speaks instead the language of administration, because administration is how cruelty survives inspection. The premise is simple and obscene. A person accused of being someone's property is presumed to be property until proven otherwise, and the burden of proof is shaped to be unlivable. The alleged fugitive is not granted the full status of a witness on their own behalf. Their testimony can be limited or disregarded. The decision can be made quickly. The commissioner is paid more for returning a person to slavery than for recognizing freedom, an incentive structure that turns judgment into commerce. The law pretends it is about order. The archive reveals it is about outcomes. Federal hands matter here because they bring the full weight of the United States government into a domestic space. A marshal's authority is not the authority of a local bully. It is the authority of the flag. The state can say, with a straight face, that it is preserving union while it tears families apart. It can say, with a straight face, that it is enforcing law while it erases personhood. That is the central transformation the act accomplishes. It nationalizes capture. It makes pursuit not a private obsession, but a public function. In a world already saturated with violence, this particular violence has a distinct texture. Plantation discipline is direct and intimate. It is carried out by owners and overseers who do not pretend to be impartial. Federal enforcement is colder. It arrives with documents and demands that everyone treat them as sacred. It compels northern citizens to participate, to assist, to become accessories in exchange for safety and compliance. It makes the ordinary person into a witness and, if needed, into a tool. It spreads culpability across the population, diluting responsibility until it feels like nobody is doing it, even as it happens. This is why the law is best understood as a pipeline. A claimant files a statement asserting ownership. The system accepts the assertion as credible by default because the system was built to accept it. A commissioner authorizes seizure. U.S. Marshals execute it. The alleged fugitive is held, transported, delivered. Each step is designed to be just plausible enough that the participants can tell themselves they are not choosing cruelty. They are following procedure. They are doing their job. They are respecting the Constitution. The archive is full of these self-exonerating phrases because the nation required them to sleep at night. But the victims did not have the luxury of abstraction. For the enslaved, the Fugitive Slave Act meant that freedom could be revoked retroactively by paperwork. It meant that even in a free state, the past could knock on the door with federal authority. It meant that the border was not a line you crossed once. It was a line you had to defend every day. It meant that any place you rested could become a holding cell, that any community could be infiltrated, that any sympathetic ally could be punished for helping. The law did not only target fugitives, it targeted the possibility of refuge itself. In the Ghana case, the act functions as the invisible hand behind the visible raid. It explains why federal marshals, not merely local officers, appear as the agents of capture. It explains why Ohio's free status does not stop the seizure. It explains the speed and confidence with which authority moves. Under the Act, pursuit is not an improvisation, it is an entitlement. It is the owner's claim converted into a federal action. The legal fiction is relentless. The enslaved are treated as property that has wandered, not as people who have fled. This fiction is not rhetorical decoration. It is the foundation upon which every subsequent decision rests. If the person is property, then the owner's loss is theft. If the person is property, then the owner's retrieval is restoration. If the person is property, then anyone who assists them is obstructing justice. The law does not need to prove the moral rightness of slavery. It needs only to maintain the classification long enough to enforce it. And classification, in a bureaucracy, is destiny. The archive reveals another layer. The federal government did not enforce this law reluctantly. It engineered enforcement into the system's incentives and tools. Marshals could be compelled to act. Citizens could be deputized. Penalties could be imposed on those who resisted or aided fugitives. The law created a climate in which neutrality became complicity and refusal became risk. It did not merely permit slave catching, it authorized it as a civic function, as if the capture of a mother and her children were a public good. This is where the legal order exposes its violence most clearly. It demands obedience not only from the enslaved, but from the free. It colonizes the consciences of those who might otherwise have looked away. It forces a choice: assist the machinery or be punished by it. In that sense, the Fugitive Slave Act is not only a weapon against fugitives, it is a test of the nation's willingness to prioritize property over life. In practice, this meant that communities in Ohio, black communities, abolitionist networks, sympathetic households, lived under a constant threat of federal intrusion. The law taught them to be careful in ways the archive rarely dignifies: coded language, quick movement, the rotation of safe houses, the discipline of secrecy. It also taught slave catchers and claimants to become sophisticated, to gather intelligence, to use courts, to enlist federal power. The border became not a moral divide, but an operational zone: surveillance, pursuit, extraction. And in that zone, the home ceases to be private. It becomes searchable. The looming fact in Part 4 is this: when federal marshals arrive, they do not arrive as rogue men, they arrive as the state. Their presence is the proof that the United States, in 1856, was willing to mobilize its authority to return children to bondage. The archive can record this as execution of process. It can make it sound tidy, but the underlying act is not tidy. It is a sanctioned tearing. There is a reason this case becomes a storm. The violence is not new. Families had been broken for generations, but the visibility is. Federal enforcement drags the machinery into public view. It makes the nation's complicity undeniable. It forces northern audiences to see that free states are not insulated from slavery's reach. The law has bridged the river more thoroughly than the ice ever could. And so, by the time the marshals move toward the place where Margaret Garner is hiding with her children, the confrontation is already loaded. It is not simply a search for fugitives. It is a demonstration of federal power. It is the system announcing that it can enter any threshold, claim any body, and call the act law. Part 4 ends with the machinery fully engaged, affidavits accepted, authority granted, federal hands deployed. The statute has done its work before a door is opened. It has already decided whose claim is recognized and whose is silenced. It has already arranged the terms of the coming intrusion. And when the intrusion arrives, it will not come as chaos. It will come as procedure. Part 5, Raid at the Door. The moment the law arrives, the language changes. Up to this point, the story can still be told as movement: a family leaving Kentucky, the river frozen, the fragile reach of Ohio. But when officers come to take them, movement becomes containment. The home, temporary, borrowed, hard-won, stops being a refuge and becomes a site. It becomes searchable space. It becomes a place where authority is allowed to interpret every object, every person, every silence as evidence. A door is no longer a boundary, it is a formality. In the records, the raid is described with the vocabulary of retrieval. Men do not invade, they execute process. They do not seize, they take custody. They do not drag a family back into slavery, they return fugitives to claimants. The archive preserves these phrases with an almost devotional consistency, because the state depends on them. If the words stay clean, the act can pretend to be clean. The raid becomes an administrative correction rather than a moral rupture. But even administrative language cannot fully cover what happens when federal authority steps inside a domestic space and claims it. The house in Ohio, often remembered as belonging to relatives or allies, was not merely a shelter, It was a declaration that the family had, however briefly, entered a different legal atmosphere. That declaration mattered because it made the response immediate and forceful. The raid is the system's answer to defiance. It is the state demonstrating that private walls do not stop public power when property is involved. There is a particular violence in the timing. The pursuit does not wait for comfort. It does not arrive with patience. It arrives while the family is still in the raw aftermath of flight, tired, disoriented, exposed. The archive will later debate jurisdictions and procedures, but in the room itself the question is simpler. Who has the right to decide what happens next? The law arrives prepared to treat that question as settled. Witness accounts and contemporary reporting, where they survive, tend to split along predictable lines. Some describe the officers as disciplined agents of legal duty. Others describe the scene as brutality, dressed as legality. The details vary, and the variations are instructive. An account that favors the state will emphasize order, resistance, necessity. An account that favors the fugitives will emphasize intrusion, fear, children, and the harshness of men who do not have to explain themselves. The archive is not a single camera. It is a set of mouths, each speaking for an interest. Still, the structural facts do not depend on anyone's sympathy. Federal enforcement entered a home in Ohio to capture a family on behalf of a Kentucky owner's claim. That alone is the raid's meaning. The nation's authority on one side of the border reaching into the other side to retrieve human beings. In that moment, the home becomes an arena in which two legal fictions collide. The first fiction is that the family has crossed into freedom. The second fiction is that the owner's claim is still valid here, in this room, on this side of the river, because the federal government says it is. The officer's presence is the physical proof that the second fiction is stronger. The raid is also where the system's moral theater becomes unavoidable. Everyone in the room is forced into roles. The marshals are not simply men, they are the visible face of statute. The claimant is not simply a person seeking property. He is the beneficiary of the state's willingness to enforce ownership beyond its local territory. The people hiding the family, if any are present, are not simply hosts. They are potential criminals in the eyes of the law, liable for aiding escape. And the family itself is reduced, by procedure, to a problem to be solved and transported. The archive likes transport. It likes bodies in motion, because bodies in motion can be documented. A person in a cage can be counted. A person in a wagon can be delivered. A person under guard can be signed for. The raid is the moment the family is transformed from fugitives into cargo. But before that transformation completes, there is the threshold. A door is a small thing. It is a hinge, a latch, a frame. Yet in the history of slavery and its enforcement, doors acquire a symbolic weight because they represent the last private claim a person can make. This space is mine. This space is not yours. Under the Fugitive Slave Act, that claim is fragile. The law grants authority to enter, to search, to remove. The door becomes something the state passes through, and in passing through it, the state announces that privacy does not apply when the property regime is threatened. The raid is therefore an invasion not only of a house, but of a concept, the concept that a family can be protected by walls. Inside the room, time compresses. The distance between discovery and catastrophe narrows. The family is confronted by men who possess not only physical force, but a social certainty. They have the backing of the state. That certainty changes how they move, how they speak, how they interpret resistance. The archive tends to record resistance as inconvenience, as proof of guilt, as justification for roughness. It rarely records resistance as the only available dignity. And then there is the presence of children. Children complicate everything the law tries to simplify. A child in a room is not an argument. It is a reality. It is a small body that reacts to fear without discipline. It is a voice that cannot be controlled by legal language. It is the living contradiction to the claim that this is merely a property dispute. The state may insist it is retrieving assets, but the child's trembling insists otherwise. This is why the raid is a turning point in the public memory of the case. The border crossing can be framed as criminality by those who prefer property. The legal procedure can be framed as due process by those who worship order. But the image, real or imagined, of federal agents entering a home to seize children on behalf of a master fractures the country's ability to pretend. It makes the violence legible to people who had trained themselves not to see it. The archive, of course, does not provide the scene in full sensory detail. It does not give every word spoken, every gesture, every moment of hesitation, but it gives enough to understand the mechanics of domination. The officers come with authority. They come with the confidence that the law will interpret their actions as legitimate. They come with a mission to remove the family from the space where they have taken shelter. They do not come to negotiate the family's humanity. They come to enforce classification. In this part of the story, Margaret Garner is still alive in the record as a fugitive, not yet as the figure who will later be cast as monster, martyr, or symbol. Here, she is a woman in a room, confronted by a system that has followed her across a river. The raid makes clear what the border already hinted. Freedom is not a location. It is a status the state can revoke if it chooses. And in 1856, the state chooses revocation. The raid at the door is not only the approach of armed men, it is the approach of inevitability, delivered in uniform. It is the moment when the family's fragile interval of hope is cut short by paperwork. It is the moment when the law proves that it can enter anywhere and call the intrusion justice. Part 5 ends at the edge of the act that will define the case. The raid has breached the threshold. Authority has entered the room. The family's options collapse, and the time for flight is over. What remains is choice under capture, choice compressed into seconds, forged in terror, and recorded afterward in language that will never be adequate. Part 6. The knife. A decision recorded in blood. There are moments the archive cannot domesticate, no matter how carefully it arranges its language. This is one of them. When the officers entered the house to reclaim the family under federal authority, the machinery of the Fugitive Slave Act expected a predictable ending: restraint, custody, removal. The system was built to make compliance the only available outcome. It assumed that terror would do the rest. It assumed that a mother, confronted by the state, would surrender her children to the state's definition of ownership. Then the assumption broke. What follows is preserved in fragments, statements given after the fact, summaries in newspapers, courtroom recitations, moral arguments dressed as testimony. Each source carries motive. Some accounts seek to sanitize the officer's role, others amplify the horror to indict the institution. Yet across the variations, the central fact remains fixed, irreducible, and impossible to soften. Margaret Garner killed her young daughter and attempted to prevent her other children from being taken back into slavery. The archive records this as an act of violence committed by an individual, but an archive-oriented reading must also record the context that made the act intelligible to the person who committed it. Slavery is a system that trains the mind toward impossible choices. It forces parents to imagine futures that are not merely difficult, but structurally cruel. Sale, separation, sexual coercion, punishment, and the slow grinding of a life reduced to labor and vulnerability. In that system, to return is not to go home. It is to be delivered back into a regime where the state recognizes the owner's claim and rejects the mother's. So the moment of the knife is not only a personal catastrophe, it is a collision between two claims to the child's life. One claim is rooted in motherhood and protection. The other is rooted in law and property. The second claim arrives armed, documented, and federally endorsed. It does not need to persuade, it only needs to take. Margaret's decision is recorded in blood because the system leaves her no cleaner instrument. The law does not offer her an appeal that can be heard in time. It does not offer her a safe delay. It does not pause to consider the child's welfare as an independent good. It comes with handcuffs and custody and the certainty that the children will be transported back across the river. The archive may debate whether Margaret intended her actions in a legal sense, but the moral intent stated afterward, attributed to her in multiple retellings, has the blunt clarity of someone who has already seen what the law refuses to see, that slavery's future violence is not hypothetical. The law calls what she did murder. The abolitionist press will later call it a form of testimony. Pro-slavery voices will call it madness, savagery, proof that the enslaved are unfit for freedom. Each label tries to stabilize the event into something usable, but the event resists stability because it reveals too much. It reveals that the institution's threat was so total that death could appear to a mother as the lesser harm. This is the part where audiences often want certainty, one clean moral sentence that resolves the discomfort. The archive does not provide that sentence. It provides instead a grim inventory. A child, approximately 2 years old, a blade, injuries to other children, a household crowded with force and fear, a mother acting under imminent capture. Then a statement, reported and repeated, that she would rather see her children dead than returned to slavery. The words endure because they are the most direct indictment possible. They are not theory. They are not politics. They are a mother describing the institution as something worse than death. And that is why the system must work so hard afterward to control the narrative. In the official logic of the United States at that time, Margaret's children were not fully hers. They were hers in the intimate sense, born from her body, raised by her labor, bonded to her presence, but they were not hers in the legal sense that matters when the state arrives. The law positioned her as a custodian of property owned by someone else. The law treated her motherhood as a temporary function inside an owner's domain. It recognized the master's claim as permanent and enforceable, and it treated the mother's claim as irrelevant. The knife exposes the cruelty of that architecture by making its consequences visible. It drags the hidden future into the present. It forces the question the statute tries to avoid: what exactly is being returned when a child is returned to slavery? The archive, in its colder registers, answers without meaning to. A return means the child can be sold. A return means the child can be separated. A return means the child can be worked, beaten, and controlled. A return means the child's body can be treated as an asset. A return means the child's personhood is subordinate to an owner's financial interest. These are not emotional claims. They are structural facts of the system, evidenced by the very records the institution produced: bills of sale, inventories, valuations, the routine documentation of human transfer. In that light, Margaret's act becomes less an eruption of inexplicable violence and more an act of refusal against a legal order that had already declared what would happen next. The state expected her to submit. She responded with a decision so extreme that it ruptured the illusion of a benign procedure. She forced the nation to see, even if only for a moment, what its laws required families to endure. There is also the question of agency, the most uncomfortable question of all. Slavery was designed to strip agency from the enslaved, to reduce them to instruments of labor and reproduction. Yet the system could never fully eliminate the human impulse to choose, to resist, to assert control over one's life and one's children. Margaret's decision is an assertion of agency under conditions where agency is punished. It is an assertion that comes at a devastating cost. It is an assertion that the archive will try to reframe as insanity or criminality, because acknowledging it as rational, acknowledging that a mother could rationally fear slavery more than death, would be to admit what slavery is. This is where the event becomes a scandal. Not because violence occurred, violence was the daily currency of the institution, but because the violence occurred in a way that could not be easily attributed to the master's whip or the overseer's hand. The violence came from the enslaved, directed inward as protection. That inversion threatened the moral alibi of slavery's defenders. It suggested that the enslaved understood the system clearly enough to choose death over its return. It suggested that the system's cruelty was not a misunderstanding, but a known, lived truth. After the knife, every party involved tries to regain control. The officers by asserting lawful authority, the claimants by reasserting ownership, the courts by sorting jurisdiction, the press by shaping public meaning. But the archive cannot erase the blunt center. A mother, cornered by a legal pipeline, turned that pipeline into a crisis the nation could not ignore. Part 7. Custody, Property, Evidence. After the blade, the room does not become quieter, it becomes official. Blood has a way of forcing institutions to speak, and the institution that arrives first is the one that knows how to classify. The law moves in, not to grieve, not to interpret, but to label. In the immediate aftermath, bodies are sorted into categories that will govern what happens next: victim, suspect, witness, fugitive, property. The same people can occupy multiple categories at once, and the archive will treat that overlap as a procedural challenge, not a moral catastrophe. This is where the system's coldest skill becomes visible. It can absorb even the most intimate violence into paperwork. The child Margaret killed becomes, in the record, a deceased, an infant, an injured party. Her name, when it appears, hovers as a fragile human detail in a file that prefers abstractions. Her body becomes evidence. Her death becomes an event to be litigated, and in a country that still legally recognized her as the property of another, even her death threatens to become a matter of asset loss rather than human loss. The archive does not always say this plainly. It does not need to. The logic is embedded in the world that created the file. If the child was property, then the property's destruction can be framed as damage. Margaret becomes a suspect in a murder case, one category. She also remains, in federal terms, an alleged fugitive, another category. And beneath both is the category the system tries hardest to preserve: enslaved. That classification is the foundation on which the owner's claim rests. It is also the classification that makes her motherhood, legally speaking, subordinate. The surviving children, injured, terrified, still living, become the most revealing objects in the system's struggle to stabilize meaning. In any humane frame, they are simply children who need protection. In the legal frame that controls the case, they are contested bodies. They are simultaneously potential witnesses, potential victims, and potential property to be reclaimed. The archive shows this tension not through explicit moral debate, but through administrative behavior. Who is allowed to hold them, where they are taken, which authority asserts priority over their custody. This is what Part 7 is about. The transformation of a family into a custody problem, and the transformation of a custody problem into a property dispute, and the transformation of a property dispute into a sequence of evidentiary steps that can be performed without ever naming the underlying horror. Custody is one of the law's most deceptive words. It can sound protective, it can suggest care, it can carry the faint suggestion of shelter, but in this context, custody is not for the benefit of the children. Custody is control of the body, while the system decides how to dispose of it. Custody is the holding pattern before removal. It is the pause in which the machinery reorients after an unexpected disruption. The disruption, Margaret's act, creates a problem for the state. It has two competing interests now, and both are compromised by the same blood. On the one hand, local authorities may want to prosecute Margaret for murder under state law. On the other, federal enforcement under the Fugitive Slave Act is designed to return fugitives quickly, with minimal interference. The system wants both, to punish the act and to preserve the owner's claim. But it is not immediately clear which procedure will be allowed to go first. And while the state argues with itself, the children remain trapped inside the argument. Evidence accumulates in predictable forms. The weapon is identified, described, perhaps preserved. The scene is narrated by those who were present and those who arrived after. Statements are taken. The law collects words the way it collects objects, not to understand suffering, but to build a case. Each statement is shaped by fear, by allegiance, by the desire to survive the coming scrutiny. The archive records those statements as if they are neutral deposits of truth. But the archive is not naive, it is strategic. It knows that testimonies can be used, and it prefers what is usable over what is complete. The most chilling aspect is how quickly the system tries to restore the logic of ownership. Even after a child is dead, even after the event has turned public attention into heat, the owner's claim is not automatically invalidated. The law does not pause and say, "This has gone too far." It continues to behave as though the main problem is procedural interference. It continues to treat the fugitive status as actionable. It continues to prepare the path of return. This reveals a central truth. Slavery's legal structure is not fragile. It does not collapse under tragedy. It metabolizes tragedy. In the archive, this metabolizing appears as a series of transitions. A household becomes a crime scene, a mother becomes a defendant, children become wards or detainees, depending on which authority speaks. A dead child becomes an exhibit. The owner's representatives become claimants. U.S. Marshals become custodians of fugitives. The language is technical, and the technicality is itself a form of violence. It creates distance between the act and its meaning. It allows officials to handle the aftermath without acknowledging the institution that produced the conditions for it. There is also the problem of narrative control. Once blood is spilled, every faction understands that public opinion is at stake. Abolitionists will emphasize the family's terror and the brutality of return. Pro-slavery advocates will emphasize the killing as proof of moral depravity among the enslaved, proof that slavery is necessary to restrain supposed savagery. Authorities will emphasize law and order. Each side will select details and discard others. The archive will preserve not one narrative, but multiple competing narratives, each attempting to conscript the dead child into an argument. What gets lost, inevitably, is the private reality of the surviving children. Their fear is not the focus of the documents. Their pain is not the center of the legal dispute. Their injuries matter insofar as they can be translated into charges or defenses. In such a system, even trauma must be made legible as evidence to count. The division between property and person becomes grotesque here because the children are both, depending on which page you are reading. One document may treat them as victims of attempted murder. Another treats them as fugitives to be returned. Another treats them as assets belonging to a claimant. The same child can be, in the same day, a wounded body deserving care and a commodity to be transported. That is not a contradiction the system tries to resolve. It is a contradiction it exploits. And Margaret, held in custody herself, becomes the site where these contradictions converge. If she is tried and punished under Ohio law, that suggests Ohio can assert authority over her as a person. If she is returned quickly under federal law, that asserts her status as property. The system wants her to be both, a person enough to punish, property enough to deliver. The archive will show this not as an ethical dilemma, but as a jurisdictional puzzle. This is why Part 7 feels like a chamber of paperwork closing around human beings. The immediate violence has ended, and a slower violence begins. The violence of classification, of custody, of evidence collection. It is a violence that can proceed without shouting. It can proceed in offices. It can proceed in courtrooms. It can proceed in polite language. The dead child cannot be returned. That is a fact the law cannot reverse. But the law can still treat her death as a disruption to be managed, rather than as a sign that the system is intolerable. It can still attempt to reclaim the living children. It can still attempt to reassert ownership over Margaret. It can still attempt to convert the event into a set of charges, defenses, and procedural outcomes that restore the world's underlying order. Part 8. Courtroom Theatre. Two Laws at War. A courtroom is where a nation pretends its violence is controlled. After the raid, after the knife, after the first wave of custody and classification, the case moves into the space the state reserves for legitimacy. The room changes, but the stakes do not. The family's bodies are still the center of the dispute. The difference is that now the dispute is performed in language that claims to be rational. This is where the system attempts to regain narrative control, where it takes a catastrophe that exposed too much and forces it into procedure. In the archive, the courtroom is loud with structure, dates, motions, jurisdictional arguments, names of officials, lists of charges. The record begins to resemble an orderly machine again. That resemblance is the point. The courtroom is not only a place where decisions are made, it is a place where decisions are dressed up as inevitability. It is where the state tells the public and tells itself that what happens next is the product of law, not the product of power. But the power is everywhere. The heart of the conflict is simple to describe and brutal to watch unfold. Ohio's interest in prosecuting a killing versus the federal government's obligation under the Fugitive Slave Act to return alleged fugitives to slaveholders. Two legal regimes collide in one case, and neither is morally neutral. One law speaks the language of criminal justice, murder, evidence, punishment. The other speaks the language of property enforcement, claim, custody, removal. The same woman stands at the intersection, and the system tries to decide which language has priority. This is not a debate about truth, it is a debate about control. In the courtroom, lawyers argue in ways that sound technical, but the technicality is merely the surface of a moral abyss. They argue whether Ohio has the right to hold Margaret Garner long enough to try her for murder. They argue whether federal authority can override state prosecution. They argue about the sequence of custody, who can hold her, who can move her, who can claim her. They present these questions as if they are questions of principle. The archive shows, if you read it without illusion, that they are questions of outcome. If Margaret is tried for murder in Ohio, she becomes, at least for that purpose, a person, a defendant, a subject of state power in a way that recognizes her capacity to commit a crime. That recognition is limited and cruel because it is recognition only to punish, but it still matters. It implies Ohio can assert authority over her in a manner that interrupts the owner's immediate claim. If Margaret is transferred quickly under the Fugitive Slave Act, she is reaffirmed primarily as property. The federal pipeline resumes. The owner's claim is satisfied. The murder becomes, at most, a secondary concern, an inconvenience that can be managed later, perhaps never. The law of slavery prefers speed. It prefers the rapid restoration of possession. It prefers to prevent any prolonged public scrutiny that might inflame abolitionist agitation. This is why the case becomes courtroom theater. Because the stage is not only for judges and lawyers, it is for the country. The courtroom produces a particular kind of cruelty. It forces a human crisis into categories that were built to deny humanity. It requires the participants to speak in abstractions while the facts remain intimate. It asks the public to treat the future of living children as a matter of competing legal competencies. It is a performance in which empathy is not admissible as evidence, and where the most reasonable argument is often the argument that preserves the existing order. Even the concept of due process becomes distorted here. Under the Fugitive Slave Act, the alleged fugitive is not afforded the full protective apparatus of a criminal defendant. The process is designed for efficiency, not fairness. The commissioner's role is less adjudication than confirmation. The alleged fugitive's testimony can be excluded. The standard of proof is shaped to favor the claimant, and the commissioner's compensation structure rewards return. These are not minor defects, they are the design. So when the courtroom considers Margaret's case, it is not weighing two equal systems. It is weighing one system that claims to punish unlawful killing and another system that exists to preserve lawful enslavement. The question is not whether the law will be served. The question is, which law will reveal less about the nation's moral core? The archive preserves moments that show how deeply this conflict unsettles the public. Abolitionists and free black communities understand that if Ohio cannot hold Margaret to prosecute the killing, then free territory is functionally meaningless when it comes to protecting fugitives. Pro-slavery advocates understand the opposite, that if Ohio can hold her, then the federal enforcement of slave property rights can be obstructed by hostile states, and the slaveholding order is threatened. The courtroom becomes a proxy war over the future of the Union, staged through the body of one woman and the lives of her children. Margaret's voice is the most fragile element in this theater. The record tends to speak around her. Lawyers speak for her or against her. Judges speak about her. Newspapers speak over her. The law treats her as a problem to be processed, not as a subject whose own explanation might matter. When her stated motive surfaces, preferring death to return, it is used as evidence of madness or evidence of moral clarity, depending on who is speaking. But in the courtroom's procedural logic, motive is rarely allowed to become indictment of the system itself. The law can recognize motive as a psychological fact, but it resists recognizing motive as political testimony, because to do so would be to put slavery on trial. So, instead, the courtroom narrows its focus to what it can manage: jurisdiction, custody, procedure. This narrowing is not a neutral choice. It is a strategy of containment. If the case stays technical, it can be resolved without confronting the institution that caused it. If the case becomes moral, it risks destabilizing the legal foundation of slaveholding power. The children, those still living, are present in this theater as absences and as stakes. Their bodies are rarely centered in the legal argument except as issue, as minors, as property, as victims, depending on which sentence you are reading. But everything turns on them. Who gets to claim them? Who gets to decide their fate? Does the state treat them as persons in need of protection or as assets in need of return? The courtroom's greatest talent is to make these questions sound like paperwork. This is also where the case's symbolic weight intensifies. The raid and the killing drew attention. The courtroom sustains it. The longer proceedings continue, the longer the public is forced to look. Abolitionist activists know how to use that attention. Slaveholders know how to fear it. Judges and officials know how to manage it. The courtroom becomes a pressure chamber. Every ruling is more than a ruling. It is a signal to the country about what kind of violence will be normalized. When the archive speaks of precedent, it is speaking of future permission. Part 9. Public Storm. Abolitionist ink and pro-slavery certainty. When a case cannot be contained by the courtroom, it escapes into print. The 19th century did not have social media, but it had something just as hungry. Newspapers, pamphlets, sermons, public letters, ink that could turn a local catastrophe into a national argument. Margaret Garner's case became combustible because it offered every faction what it needed: a story vivid enough to mobilize emotion and ambiguous enough to be weaponized. The facts were horrifying. The interpretations were endless. And once the public storm began, no legal proceeding could fully control what the country was now forced to imagine. The archive of this storm is not a single text. It is a chorus of competing documents, each with its own agenda, each selecting details like ammunition. Abolitionist publications framed the raid and the killing as a living indictment of slavery, proof that the institution was so violent it could make death look like mercy. Pro-slavery papers framed the same event as an eruption of depravity, proof that the enslaved were dangerous, irrational, and in need of containment. Moderates tried to retreat into law and order, insisting that emotion must not interfere with statute. In this storm, even neutrality was a position, and it was rarely innocent. Abolitionist Inc. did what the courtroom resisted. It named the system. Where the law spoke of fugitives, abolitionist writing spoke of a family seeking refuge. Where the law spoke of property, abolitionist writing spoke of human beings hunted across a border. Where the law spoke of return, abolitionist writing translated the word into its lived meaning: forced re-enslavement, sale, punishment, and the perpetual vulnerability of children to an owner's need. The most powerful abolitionist accounts did not treat Margaret's act as a spectacle. They treated it as testimony, the kind that arrives not through polite language, but through the body. A mother's violence against her own child was framed not as a moral example to imitate, but as evidence of what slavery demanded and what it destroyed. In that framing, Margaret is not the primary horror. Slavery is. But Abolitionist Inc. also faced a problem. The act itself was intolerable. It could not be made safe. It could only be made meaningful. Writers leaned on the reported statement attributed to Margaret that she would rather see her children dead than return to force readers to confront the true stakes. They argued that anyone shocked by the killing should be more shocked by the system that made such a choice thinkable. They asked Northern audiences to stop treating slavery as a distant Southern sin and recognize it as a national crime enforced by federal agents on Northern soil. And in that insistence, they attacked the most fragile lie of the era, that the North could remain clean while profiting from and enforcing bondage. Pro-slavery certainty responded with its own ink and its own kind of clarity. It did not argue that slavery was gentle. It argued that slavery was necessary. In that worldview, Margaret's act was not proof that slavery was monstrous. It was proof that the enslaved were monstrous. The killing was framed as savage, unnatural, barbaric. The language was chosen to place Margaret outside the boundaries of recognizable motherhood. It was an attempt to strip her of the one claim that threatened the property regime most directly, the claim that her children were hers in a way no law could legitimately override. If slavery's defenders could convince the public that Margaret was not a mother in any meaningful sense, only a dangerous creature, then the system could reclaim its moral alibi. The problem would become individual pathology rather than institutional cruelty. The death of a child would become an argument for tighter control, not for abolition. This is how pro-slavery certainty functioned. It took the unbearable and made it useful to power. It is important to understand the mechanics of this certainty. It did not require accurate detail. It required emotional effect. Pro-slavery accounts often highlighted the gore and suppressed the context. They described the knife, the blood, the supposed frenzy, and then treated the background capture, return, the legal pipeline as incidental. The case was rewritten as a parable about what happens when enslaved people are corrupted by abolitionist interference, or when the natural order of slave discipline is disrupted. In this telling, federal enforcement is recast as restraint, and Margaret's resistance is cast as criminal madness. The press, then, does not merely report the event. It stages it again and again, each time with different lighting, different moral cues, different omissions. Between these poles, the law and order faction performed its own kind of evasion. Their writing often condemned the killing while insisting that the Fugitive Slave Act must be obeyed. They spoke of tragedy, regrettable but irrelevant to the necessity of enforcement. They framed the abolitionists as agitators who exploited suffering to destabilize the Union. This posture treated the law as sacred and morality as disruptive. It asked the public to accept that a statute could be enforced, even if its enforcement produced scenes that shattered the conscience. In doing so, it revealed a hierarchy of values: union first, property rights second, human life somewhere far below. The archive of public reaction also shows how different communities read the case through different kinds of fear. For black communities in the North, the case was not hypothetical. It was a warning that federal power could enter their neighborhoods and seize people under claims made elsewhere. It was proof that freedom was conditional and could be challenged by any paper-bearing stranger. For abolitionists, it was a rallying point, an emotional fact that could pierce complacency. For slaveholders and their allies, it was a crisis of control. If public sympathy shifted, enforcement might become politically unstable. For moderates, it was an inconvenience that threatened their preferred illusion of national harmony. In this storm, Margaret Garner becomes less a person and more a contested symbol. That transformation is itself a kind of violence, because it strips her life of texture and leaves only the parts useful to argument. Yet symbolization is unavoidable once a story enters mass print. The public does not consume nuance easily. It consumes archetypes: the monstrous mother, the desperate martyr, the criminal fugitive, the tragic victim. Each archetype performs political labor. And still, beneath the archetypes, the event keeps its raw edge. A child is dead. Other children are wounded. A mother is in custody. A federal law is being invoked to return a family to bondage. No amount of editorial certainty can change those facts. What it can change is what readers think those facts mean, and what they think should happen next. The public storm matters because it turns the case into pressure on institutions. Judges and officials do not operate in a vacuum. They operate under political weather. The louder the abolitionist outcry, the more visible the moral cost of compliance becomes. The louder the pro-slavery outrage, the more intense the demand for swift enforcement and punitive response becomes. The case becomes a test not only of law, but of narrative dominance, whose framing will become the nation's memory. Part 9 ends with the country speaking in competing inks, each insisting it has found the truth. But the archive, when read coldly, shows something else: a society trying to manage an event that exposed its foundational contradiction. The public does not argue because the facts are unclear. It argues because the facts are too clear. And in that clarity, the nation recognizes itself and recoils. Part 10. Family as target. The price of return. A system that survives by possession cannot tolerate the idea of a family choosing itself. After the public storm, after the courtroom theater, the case does not resolve into justice. It resolves into logistics. The archive begins to sound like transport again. Custody transfers, orders issued, bodies moved. This is where slavery proves its most durable talent, the ability to outlast outrage. Newspapers can burn hot for a week and then move on. Courts can argue jurisdiction and then deliver a ruling. But the system that turns people into property does not depend on attention. It depends on routine, and routine resumes as soon as the opportunity appears. The price of return is not paid in money alone, though money is always present somewhere in the background. It is paid in dispersal. It is paid in the breaking of kinship into manageable parts. It is paid in the slow conversion of a family into a set of separate problems. A woman to be held, children to be claimed, a dead child to be filed away, injuries to be treated only insofar as they interfere with transport. The archive rarely announces this as cruelty. It presents dispersal as administration. By this point, Margaret Garner is no longer only a symbol and no longer only a defendant. She is a body in custody whose movement will be decided by competing authorities. Her children are no longer only victims and no longer only fugitives. They are contested property, and the contest is not philosophical, it is practical. Who physically holds them? Who can move them? Who can sign for them? Who can override an objection? In a world shaped by slavery, these questions are not abstractions. They are mechanisms that decide whether a child stays with a mother or becomes a separate line in someone else's ledger. The law's rhetoric of return implies a restoration of order. But what is being restored is not a family. It is a claim. It is the owner's ability to enforce possession despite flight, despite injury, despite public scandal. Return is the system's assertion that no amount of suffering changes the underlying rule. The enslaved are retrievable. That retrievability is the real target. Because slavery cannot function if escape becomes plausible. It cannot function if borders become meaningful. It cannot function if northern outrage can interrupt the pipeline. So the system's response to the Garner case must do more than handle one family. It must re-establish deterrence. It must demonstrate that flight ends in capture and that capture ends in re-enslavement. It must teach every other enslaved mother watching directly or through rumor that the state will pursue, retrieve, and punish. The system does not need every person to believe it is just. It needs every person to believe it is inevitable. The price of return, then, is paid by those forced to become examples. In an archive-oriented telling, the aftermath is often the most painful section because it is where the record thins. Catastrophe produces documents. Routine produces disappearance. Once the legal spectacle fades, the people at the center of it are reabsorbed into the machinery that does not preserve their full names, their full histories, or the full accounting of what happens to their children. The archive is robust when power is challenged in public. It is sparse when power resumes its daily work. This is not a gap you can fill with imagination and still call it documentary. It is a gap you must treat as evidence. The disappearance of detail is itself a form of violence, a second erasure after the first. The system that could track a human being as property could also allow that human being to vanish into transfer records, into plantations, into forced movement, into deaths that were never recorded with the dignity of a full account. In slavery's world, a person's life is documented when it benefits ownership. When it does not, silence is permitted. So the aftermath becomes a story told through hardened edges. We know there was an attempt to prosecute. We know federal authority pressed for removal. We know that the surviving children were at risk of being separated and reclaimed. We know that Margaret's body became subject to transport. We know that, in the logic of the era, even pregnancy could become part of this calculus because slavery valued reproduction as property growth, and the law could treat an unborn child as future asset. The system's persistence is the point. Return, in this context, is not a single event. It is a process. The process begins with custody and ends with reclassification. In the courtroom, Margaret may be called a defendant. In the transport record, she becomes a fugitive returned. In the ledger, she becomes an entry again. The same woman moves through different documents and becomes different things, depending on what the document needs. The archive does not always reconcile these identities, because reconciliation would require recognizing her as one continuous person. The system prefers discontinuity. It prefers to keep her fragmented into categories that can be managed. The children suffer the most from this discontinuity because children are easier to separate than adults. A child can be reassigned. A child can be renamed or left unnamed. A child can be absorbed into another household and become a rumor rather than a recorded life. The archive's greatest cruelty toward enslaved children is how easily they become untraceable, how their futures can be dissolved into the ordinary churn of sale and transfer. This is the family as target, not merely captured, but dismantled. The phrase family values appears often in the era's moral rhetoric, but the institution of slavery required the systematic violation of family bonds to function. Family is the one structure that gives enslaved people a claim beyond the owners. It creates loyalties the master does not control. It produces reasons to flee, reasons to resist, reasons to endure in ways that cannot be priced. Slavery's response is predictable. It breaks families to prevent those loyalties from becoming power. In Margaret Garner's case, the act that horrified the public, killing her child, was, in a terrible way, a mirror held up to slavery's routine. The institution broke children away from mothers as a matter of commerce. Margaret broke a child away from slavery as an act of protection. The system condemned her for violence while continuing its own, slower violence with legal blessing. The difference is that the system's violence could be called order. That is the hypocrisy the archive cannot fully conceal. The price of return is also paid in the psychological register, the way terror becomes a language spoken across plantations and borders. The case would have traveled by word of mouth as much as by print. Enslaved people would have learned, in fragmentary retellings, what happened when a family reached Ohio and was still found. They would have learned that federal hands could enter a free state and take children. They would have learned, too, that a mother could choose death over return. The system would have understood the risk of such knowledge. It would have understood that stories can be weapons. Return, therefore, is also an attempt to control the story by controlling the bodies. Part 10 ends with a grim recognition. The public storm did not dismantle the machinery. The courtroom did not rescue the family. The law did what it was designed to do. It sought to restore possession, to disperse the human bonds that threatened it, and to render the survivors back into the archive's preferred form: assets, fugitives, entries. If the earlier parts showed the dramatic collision between a mother and the state, this part shows the state's endurance. It does not need to shout, it only needs to keep moving. And when it moves through families first. Part 11. Afterlives in text, from archive to beloved. The archive is not the end of a story. It is the beginning of an afterlife. Margaret Garner's case did not remain where the state tried to keep it, in court files, in clipped newspaper columns, in the administrative language of custody and return. It escaped. It traveled. It became a signal passed from one generation to the next, carrying a kind of dark energy, proof that the institution could corner a mother into an impossible act, and proof that the nation could respond by arguing over procedure instead of ending the system that produced it. This part is about that escape into text, and about what happens when the archive fails to hold everything it should. Official records preserve facts, but they rarely preserve interiority. They can tell you that a family crossed a frozen river, that federal officers arrived, that a child died, that courts disputed jurisdiction, that the press erupted. They cannot tell you, with certainty, what it felt like to hold a child while hearing boots at the door. They cannot tell you how a mother's mind calculates the future, when the future is written in sale notices and whips. They cannot tell you what it means to know that your children are legally retrievable, that your love is not recognized as a claim. The archive can catalogue events, but it cannot resurrect the private dread that made those events coherent. This is where literature enters, not as replacement, but as a different kind of record. To say that Toni Morrison's Beloved was inspired by Margaret Garner is to name a passage from document to imagination, from legal category to human complexity. Inspiration is not equivalence. The novel is not a transcript. It does not pretend to be. It takes the historical kernel, an enslaved mother killing her child, rather than seeing the child return to slavery, and builds around it a structure that the archive could not or would not provide: interior voice, memory, haunting, and the long shadow of trauma that does not stop when the court adjourns. Morrison's work functions like a secondary archive, one that does not claim neutrality and does not hide behind procedure. It does what official history often refuses to do. It insists that the past is not past, that violence leaves residue, that slavery's consequences continue to inhabit bodies and homes long after emancipation is declared. In Beloved, the dead do not remain silent. They return as presence, they demand recognition. They disrupt the living in the way unacknowledged harm always does. This is not embellishment, it is an argument about reality. In the historical record, Margaret Garner is frequently turned into an object, the defendant, the fugitive, the murderess, the symbol. Her voice appears in reported fragments, filtered through hostile or strategic narration. Her children's voices barely appear at all. The archive preserves an event but not a full human chorus. Morrison's novel refuses that silence. It restores a kind of agency by giving the enslaved not only actions but consciousness, fear, desire, shame, tenderness, rage. It does not sanitize, it does not explain away. It makes the reader inhabit what the archive only points toward. That inhabitation is the point. Because the moral difficulty of Margaret Garner's act cannot be resolved by stating the fact. The fact alone is too blunt. It risks becoming either spectacle or slogan. The archive, especially in the hands of polemicists, can turn the case into a weapon and lose the human. Fiction, at its best, can slow the reader down. It can refuse the quick exit of moral certainty. It can hold contradictory truths in the same room. That killing a child is horrific, and that slavery is a system that makes horror rational. It can make the reader feel the trap that the law called return. In this sense, Beloved does not merely borrow from the archive, it interrogates it. It asks what the official record cannot contain, and it exposes the gaps as meaningful. Why do we know the names of officials and not the names of children? Why do we have statutes and not lullabies? Why are property claims documented in detail while family bonds are treated as irrelevant? These are questions the novel forces into the foreground by constructing a world where the emotional and psychological consequences are not optional footnotes. They are the central text. And then there is haunting. Haunting is often dismissed as metaphor, but in the context of slavery, it is closer to description. The past returns in bodies through inherited fear, through learned vigilance, through the way communities carry grief that was never formally honored. The past returns in language through the terms and categories that linger in law and custom. The past returns in silence through what families cannot speak, because speaking would reopen what was never healed. Morrison makes haunting literal, because the literal is sometimes the only way to express the magnitude of what the archive refuses to say plainly. That slavery produced deaths that did not stay contained, and crimes that were never adjudicated as crimes. The transition from archive to literature is therefore not a decorative cultural footnote. It is a continuation of the case. When Morrison writes, she is writing against the administrative flattening that the legal system performed on Margaret Garner. She is writing against the reduction of a mother to a category. She is writing against the national tendency to treat slavery as a resolved chapter rather than as a living inheritance. The novel becomes a form of counter-documentation, not what happened in the narrowest sense, but what it meant, and what it did, and what it continues to do. This is why the case survives in cultural memory, not because it is comfortable, and not because it offers a clean moral, but because it refuses closure. It keeps forcing the question that the courtroom tried to avoid. What kind of nation builds laws that make a mother choose between her child's life and her child's enslavement? The archive can record that such a choice was made. Literature can make the reader feel the weight of it. There is also a risk in afterlives. Cultural memory can simplify. It can turn tragedy into icon. It can detach a story from the specific structures that produced it and treat it as a timeless human drama, as if the historical machinery were incidental. That is why an archive-oriented approach matters even here. We must keep the legal and political architecture in view, the Fugitive Slave Act, the border regime, the federal pipeline of enforcement, so that the story does not become merely psychological or mythic. Morrison's genius is not that she makes the story universal by stripping it of history. It is that she makes the history unbearable to ignore by revealing its intimate consequences. In the end, the afterlife of Margaret Garner's case in Beloved is a form of refusal. Refusal to let the record's silences stand as the final word. The novel does not overwrite the archive. It stands beside it like a witness who has learned that the official transcript is incomplete. Part 11 ends with that uneasy pairing, the cold files of law and the living record of art. One tells you what the state was willing to document, the other tells you what the state made necessary. Between them, the case continues no longer only as history, but as haunting evidence. Part 12, closing the file, what the records refuse to say. At the end of a case, the archive wants closure. It wants a final ruling, a final transfer, a final notation in a margin that signals completion. It wants to move the file from active to stored, from the urgency of attention to the quiet of shelving. The state prefers endings because endings imply resolution, and resolution implies legitimacy. But the Margaret Garner case does not resolve. It only stops being recorded with the same intensity. The difference matters. A file can close while the harm continues. So the last part must be an inventory not of everything, because the archive never gives everything, but of what remains and what is missing, and of what the missing itself proves. What remains is the scaffolding of law, statutes, warrants, custody orders, court minutes, administrative phrases that carry human beings the way a conveyor carries freight. What remains is the press record, editorials, pamphlets, moral accusations printed as certainty, sympathy printed as argument. What remains is a handful of reported statements and descriptions filtered through the interests of those who preserved them. What remains is the fact pattern that history repeats because it is so stark. A family crossed a frozen river. Federal authority arrived to enforce an owner's claim. A mother killed her child rather than see her return to slavery. What remains, too, is the collision itself. A mother's claim versus a legal system designed to render that claim irrelevant. What the records refuse to say is often more revealing than what they announce. They refuse to say, in plain terms, that the nation's legal order required the forced return of children into bondage. They refuse to say that property rights here meant the right to control bodies, to separate families, to extract labor, to profit from reproduction. They refuse to say that federal enforcement was not an unfortunate side effect, but an intentional design. They refuse to say that the law's neutrality was a mask, because admitting the mask would require naming the face beneath it. They also refuse to say the quiet things that make a person whole. The archive does not preserve Margaret's voice in full. It preserves her as an object of debate. It preserves her motives as reported fragments enough to inflame, not enough to restore her interior life. It does not preserve her ordinary days, the gestures of care, the exhaustion, the private strategies of survival, the small acts of love that persist even under domination. The archive is rich in the language of power and poor in the language of life. And then there are the children. One of the most brutal truths in any slavery archive is how easily children disappear. A dead child can be fixed in record by the fact of death. Death makes paperwork. A living child can vanish into the churn of re-enslavement, sale, forced movement, renaming. The archive often does not follow. It treats the child's future as the owner's business, not as a historical question worthy of sustained attention. The child becomes a line item that can be moved to another ledger, another county, another set of hands. The trail breaks, and the break is not merely accidental, it is structural. The system was built to make the enslaved traceable as property when convenient and untraceable as persons when inconvenient. This is what the records refuse to say, that the disappearance is part of the violence. The case also refuses to offer the kind of moral comfort that audiences often seek. There is no clean lesson that leaves the listener feeling safely on the correct side of history. The case implicates too many. It implicates the federal government that enforced the Fugitive Slave Act. It implicates northern citizens who complied or looked away. It implicates institutions that treated custody as paperwork rather than protection. It implicates a national political order that prioritized union and property over human life. And it implicates, inevitably, the reader or listener who benefits from distance and hindsight, who can approach the case as narrative rather than as lived terror. The archive can catalogue culpability in names and offices, but it cannot force an ethical reckoning. That work is left to those who read. If there is a final confrontation in this story, it is not only the moment of the raid or the moment of the knife, it is the confrontation between two definitions of legal. In the United States of 1856, slavery was legal. The forced return of fugitives was legal. The classification of children as property was legal. The deployment of federal marshals to enforce ownership across state lines was legal. These are not marginal details. They are the core. And Margaret Garner's Act, whatever language one uses for it, confronted legality with its consequences. It forced the nation to see that legal did not mean moral, and that order could be built on systematic theft of personhood. The archive, in its coldest mood, tries to treat the case as an anomaly, a shocking episode, a sensational headline, a courtroom dispute. But the deeper truth is that the case is a condensation of routine. The raid at the door was a routine function of federal enforcement. The threat of return was routine. The separation of families was routine. The vulnerability of children to sale was routine. The only anomaly, in the eyes of the system, was the refusal that interrupted routine with blood. That refusal is why the case survives. And yet, even that survival is complicated, because the case survives partly as symbol invoked, adapted, transformed into literature. The afterlife in Beloved ensures that the story continues to trouble the national imagination, but it also means that many people encounter the event first as art, not as record. Art can carry truths the archive cannot, but it can also be misunderstood as invention. The state's preferred outcome is always the same: to keep the violence safely in the past, safely in fiction, safely in then. The archive helps with that by closing files. Closing the file is not the same as closing the wound. So, what do we do with a case like this? At the end, we do not resolve it. We name what it reveals. We refuse the comfort of distance. We treat the legal record not as proof of fairness, but as evidence of the system's priorities. We recognize that the most important questions the case raises are not procedural, they are existential. What does it mean for a nation to build a legal structure in which a mother's love has no standing against a property claim? What does it mean for federal authority to be used to deliver children back into bondage? What does it mean that public outrage could flare and still fail to dismantle the machinery? What does it mean that the archive preserves the voices of officials more readily than the voices of the enslaved? These are the questions the records refuse to ask, because asking them would make the entire system look like what it was: an engineered moral catastrophe. In the end, the Margaret Garner case is not simply a tragedy of one family. It is a portrait of a country's legal conscience, exposed under stress. It shows how law can be mobilized to defend ownership at the cost of humanity, and how a person cornered by that law can produce an act so extreme that it shatters the nation's preferred story about itself. The file closes, the ink dries, the archive returns the case to storage. But the evidence does not disappear. It remains in the structure of what was written and what was withheld. It remains in the gap between legality and justice. It remains in the fact that a mother, faced with return, answered the state in the only way she believed the state could not undo. And that is what the records refuse to say plainly. The most devastating testimony against slavery was not always spoken. Sometimes it was forced into action.